Hello, Dr. Newman here. Welcome back to History of the English Language. In this video, we will be moving on from the prehistory of English and into the Old English period. In this first video, I'm going to talk a little bit, just give you a little bit of an overview of the history, contextualizing the arrival of Germanic language in Britain and the sort of why we call it Old English, where it comes from. The image that you see on the screen here is an example of the very elaborate material culture of the Old English people. It is a cover of the Gospel of Matthew in what's known as the Lindisfarne Gospels, which were a very, very valuable codex manuscript. Codex means a book that you can flip as opposed to a scroll book. Which was really like a first millennium just killer technology, really transformed things, especially in the Christian world and the Islamic world as well. You can see that it says Liber Generationem Jesu something, 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 and this is the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. And you're like, wait a second, that's not Old English, that's Latin. Yes, and we will talk about this. Latin is also kind of a big deal in Britain at this time, especially because of its associations with religion, with the Christian church. And these Germanic-speaking peoples arrived in Britain starting in around 400, though there had been raiding parties before then based on accounts that we have, such as Survive. But by 800, pretty much all of them were Christian. Jutes came from the end of the Denmark Peninsula up at the northern part of Western Europe here. The Angles from the base. And there's this part that juts out from the eastern part of the peninsula that hooks around. And I've heard the theory that Angles are named after that angle, that hook, that looked like a fish hook. If you've ever heard the term angling for fishing, they thought it looked like a fish hook, and that this is where the word angle comes from. So English comes from angle, actually, and so the English language is named after a fish hook. Whoa. The Saxons were another Germanic group who came from coastal Germany. So this area west of Denmark, an area which I think is known as Lower Saxony. Then there were the Frisians. Another group who came into Romano-Britain, and many of them remained behind as well, and they spoke the language most closely related to the Angles and the Saxons for reasons you can see now. The Frisians also came into Britain, and south of the Frisians, getting into what is today France, were another Germanic people called the Franks, but they for the most part stayed where they were, settled down, and started speaking Latin, although the Latin that they spoke was very much altered by whatever Frankish must have been like, because French, of course, is one of the Romance languages that has undergone almost more phonological change than any other Romance language. I could be wrong about that. I'm not a Romance, I'm not a historian of Romance languages. All of these people first raided and then settled in Britain, in the territory of a people who are referred to basically as Romano-Britons. And the Romano-Britons were largely ethnically Celts, and the Brythonic language, or the Brittonic language, the ancestor to modern Welsh and Breton, was spoken there. It's closely related to Irish and Gaelic and Scots and other Celtic languages. But Latin was also spoken there, and there was probably a situation where both languages were spoken, and Celtic languages were more likely spoken outside of towns and in rural areas, and in the towns, Latin would have been more likely heard. It was in Roman culture was really essentially an urban culture, and when the Romans took over Britain and lived there for a few hundred years, they brought many features of material culture that would have not been out of place in Italy. Amphitheaters, baths, villa houses, all of which you might find in a Latin textbook, Metella est in horda. But when the Roman Empire slowly collapsed like a flan in a cupboard, and the Romans said, hey, we're being invaded by Germanic peoples, and the Romans down in Italy were like, sorry, so are we, can't help you right now, we're kind of in a jam. And so all these Germanic peoples moved into Britain, and in the 19th century, there was a kind of view that these people came and drove out and massacred and killed all the Celts, driving them either north into Scotland or west into Wales and Cornwall. Genetic evidence suggests that this is not the case. There's actually genetically not much difference at all between Welsh people and Scottish people and English people, suggesting that there was migration and intermixing, and that the kind of the imaginary idea that the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes came and just massacred and drove out and resettled was maybe influenced by a projection of what English-speaking people had done in various places, and other European people had done in various places around the world since the 1600s. You'll note that I'm avoiding using the term Anglo-Saxon. The term Anglo-Saxon was not used very much. It's only within a 50-year window, late in the Old English period, that term was used. It's kind of a weird mashup of two different peoples that doesn't actually designate any specific people, and it's a term that comes freighted with a lot of modern racial baggage that is honestly, I think it's best to avoid. I don't think the term offers many conveniences that are worth all of the baggage that it comes with. And you can Google this and learn more about it if you want. That's where I stand on this matter. There's nothing that the term Anglo-Saxon communicates that early medieval English doesn't communicate without being a racist dog whistle. The term eventually, anyway, they settled in Romano-Britain, which is today's England, which they would have called Anglo-Land at the time. A lot of what we know about this period comes from a historian named Bede, who wrote in Latin. He was a monk at the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow. He's an author of many theological works and biblical commentaries, and in 731 he completed a work called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This history was intended to illustrate God's providence in bringing the benighted Germanic people of England into the Holy Church, and he is one of the doctors of the Church, a designation by the Roman Catholic Church they don't give out very easily. Doctor means teacher, by the way, in Latin. So he's one of the great teachers of Catholic Christianity, one of only 36, including such luminaries as Jerome, Augustine, Aquinas, and recently Hildegard of Bingen. Early medieval English society. Let's talk a little bit about it. Here you have pictured the famous Sutton Hoo burial mask, which is on the cover of many textbooks about Old English society. It was found in a treasure hoard unearthed in the 1930s, which was a burial treasure of pre-Christian Old English society. There's a boar figured on, or boar's heads figured on this burial mask, and boars were sacred to Germanic peoples, from what I understand. There, in early medieval English society, people lived in tribal groups with a high class of warriors who were called eorlas, which is where modern earl comes from, and common laborers, churlas. And the modern word churl comes from that, which is like, and the word churlish, which is to be coarse or rough. And in English and in other languages, there's a kind of association between moral vocabulary and class vocabulary. The word villainous, for instance, or villain, which is from French, originally meant peasant, right? Anyway, these people came to call their common language over time Anglish, perhaps because a lot of mostly all the Angles came to Britain, but a bunch of Saxons stayed behind on the continent and spoke something that was Saxonish. And as those languages diverged, it just became a matter of convenience to refer to the West Germanic spoken in the British Isles as English. These people did become Christian. Took several centuries. and there was some back and forth, and there was some fighting, but they did become Christian, but they still valued heroic ideals, traditional heroes. They maintained their warrior culture to a great extent. What we understand from their stories and from their dialogues is that they valued family, virtue, storytelling, togetherness. They feared humiliation and loneliness. They feared exile. They feared the wilderness. And sounds like people, hey? As far as the lives they led, they had simple buildings and clothes, but they had elaborate and sophisticated metalwork. As far as their buildings, I sometimes wonder whether they didn't have more sophisticated buildings and clothes than we know about. But they would have built with the materials that were commonly available to them, which would have been wood, leather, textiles, and those things do not survive in the damp climate of England like gold does. While most people spoke English, Latin was maintained by monks in monasteries. Latin had become a sacred language of the church. The Bible, the Latin Bible, translated by Jerome, was used, and monasteries were centers of learning and culture. And it was in the monasteries that early medieval English texts survived. Most of the Old English writing that survives is religious in nature. A lot of it is sermons and homilies. Some of it is translations of the Bible. Some of it is translations of Christian classics and theological works and commentaries into Old English. Some of it is poetic adaptations of Christian themes and biblical stories into Old English. You can learn about this from your reading in Van Gilderen and in Seth Lear's Inventing English, Chapter 1. Latin was the language of Christianity, though. And here you see an item, a gold band, and on it is inscribed, Surge Domine et dissipentur inimici tui et fugiant qui oderunt te facie tua. Rise up, Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and those who hate you be driven from your face. You can see how these people who were belonged to a warrior culture may have responded to parts of the Bible that seemed, the more metal to them, if you take my meaning. So in England, we have a sociolinguistics situation that has often been referred to as diglossia. Diglossia is a situation in which two languages or two varieties of the same language are used under different conditions within a community, often by the same speakers. A lot of people speak different varieties of the language. We talk about code switching and pet peeves, right? And so somebody who's an African American may belong to or be a member of one community where they speak a stronger version of AAVE, and then they go to a job perhaps where they're a minority in that environment and have to speak to standard American English, and that is an example of a diglossic situation. In early medieval England, Latin was the language of the church. It might have often been used for legal administration and records, but the everyday language would have been Old English. Prestige is the level of regard that we normally accord to a specific language or dialect within a speech community relative to other languages or dialects. So Latin would have been a very high prestige language. English would have been prestigious at first to those who spoke it, but maybe would have been considered less important. But late in the Middle Ages, Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex, in the face of Danish incursions, managed to fight them off and establish centers of learning in Winchester, in what was then the area of Wessex in the southwest of England, where he promoted a program of translation and adaptation of Latin sources to Old English, raising the status of Old English. And chronicles, histories, theological works, sermons, textbooks, all kinds of things were written in English, which actually is really, really early for a vernacular in Western Europe. When I talk about vernacular, I'm using a term that refers to a language of everyday speech as opposed to a learned or a religious or a rhetorical or a sacred language. Here, and I think this is the last slide for this show, is a map of the dialects of Old English. Old English was not a uniform language. If you ever study Old English in university, it's very likely that you will study the West Saxon dialect because of the program of Alfred the Great to make West Saxon texts. But if you'll see here that there was the Wessex dialect, or the West Saxon dialect. There was Kentish, spoken in southeastern England, where in modern Kent, where Canterbury is. Mercian, farther to the north in what's today the Midlands. Here's the Humber River, pictured here, kind of in the north of England, and north of the Humber River was the area called Northumbria, which meant the place north of the Humber River. Northumbrian is the ancestor to the modern Scots language, which is in a dialect continuum with modern English. And so Scots is not just a weird accent of English, but is a kind of early branch off. If you read like the poetry of Robert Burns, for instance, you'll get a flavor of the Scots language, not just a Scottish accent. And over here in the West, this kind of semi-peninsula is the country of the nation of Wales, where the Celtic language of Brittonic continued to be spoken and became modern Welsh. That's all the news that's fit to print today. I hope you've enjoyed this, and get at me with any questions that you may have.